Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're digging into a really complex situation. It's one where a policy designed to help one industry actually sent these huge ripples, shockwaves really, through the whole economy. We are talking about lumber tariffs and the, frankly, surprising and often difficult impact they've had on the U.S. housing market. Our main source today, which really lays out this alarming chain of events, is Trump's tariffs and the lumber crisis. So our mission here is to unpack how this one trade policy ended up creating a real crisis, not just for big builders, but for, regular families trying to buy a home. Okay, so let's start at the beginning. Where did this all kick off? Our sources point pretty clearly to former President Trump bringing back some pretty steep tariffs on Canadian softwood lumber.
Right. And what's really striking, I think, is the reason given for it, the stated intention, anyway. It was pitched as a way to protect U.S. lumber producers from what they called unfair trade practices.
Unfair trade practices, like subsidies, maybe?
Exactly. Things like alleged Canadian government subsidies or selling below cost, sometimes called dumping. So the whole move was framed as, a necessary step, protecting American jobs, asserting a kind of economic strength.
Okay, sounds straightforward enough on the surface, but the sources we looked at, they suggest there were warnings right from the start. What were people in the industry saying?
Yeah, and that's a key point. Were these warnings actually listened to? I mean, experts, including many within the U.S. lumber sector, were pointing out a fundamental problem. The U.S. just doesn't produce enough lumber, not domestically. Not enough to meet its own demand, especially for housing.
So we rely on imports.
Heavily. Particularly Canadian softwood. It's essential for framing homes, for infrastructure. These experts stress that Canadian wood wasn't just about volume, it was crucial for keeping prices, somewhat stable. The message was basically, if you restrict the supply too much, you're going to shake the whole foundation of the market.
And it seems like those warnings, well, they weren't just theory. Our sources describe the outcome using words like disastrous. So fast forward a bit. What actually happened? What was the immediate fallout once these tariffs took hold?
Well, it became this kind of paradoxical situation almost immediately. You had American timber companies, the very ones supposedly being protected. They started reporting huge losses.
Wait, the American companies lost out? How?
Exactly. It seems counterintuitive, right?
Yeah.
But one of the largest U.S. timber firms, seen as a bedrock of the housing supply chain, faced massive financial hits, and they pointed directly at the tariffs. It wasn't just about blocking Canadian wood. It seems the tariffs completely disrupted the complex global supply chains these American companies also relied upon.
Okay. So it wasn't just a simple U.S. versus Canada thing?
Not at all. Suddenly, they faced skyrocketing costs for their own raw materials, contracts were lost, big projects just stopped, stock prices fell, and then, unfortunately, you saw the human cost. Layoffs started hitting mill workers, contractors, spreading across several states. It became, as the sources put it, a case of self-inflicted wounds.
Wow. Okay, so if the big timber companies are hurting, what does that cascade down to? What does it mean for, the average person listening and be someone hoping to buy a house or even build one?
Well, connecting those dots, the housing market took a really significant blow. It's pretty direct. Lumber prices spiked dramatically. So home builders, they're looking at these costs and suddenly projects don't make financial sense anymore. Many paused work, some canceled developments altogether.
So fewer houses being built.
Exactly. And for you, the potential home buyer, that means two things, neither of them good. One, the houses that are available become much more expensive because the input costs are higher. Two, there's simply fewer homes coming onto the market. We saw affordable housing advocates calling it a crisis fueled by politics. They argued that for lots of families, especially first-time buyers, that dream of homeownership just got pushed further away. The affordability gap widened significantly.
And economists, are they linking this directly, the tariffs to the housing crunch? What does the data actually show about, say, how much Canadian lumber we normally use? And what did Canada do when these tariffs hit? Did they just stop selling?
Autonomous definitely drew a line. And the data's pretty clear. Canadian lumber usually makes up more than a quarter, over 25% of all the lumber consumed in the U.S. So restricting that supply, it was bound to shake things up. But what's really fascinating is Canada's reaction. They didn't just, wait around.
They found other buyers.
They pivoted fast. They started redirecting their lumber exports to other markets, places like Europe and Asia that were eager for supply, which kind of highlights how globalized this trade is, right? And it left American buyers in a tough spot, scrambling to find alternatives and, crucially, paying much, much higher prices for whatever wood they could find.
So it sounds like the policy didn't quite have the intended leverage, globally speaking. And back home, you mentioned these disastrous effects. Our sources talk about a real split in opinion, though. Not everyone agrees this was a mistake.
No, definitely not a consensus. You had, on one side, former President Trump. He remained pretty defiant, insisting the tariffs were, fundamentally necessary, part of a larger fight for American industry. The argument was sort of short-term pain for long-term gain, that any immediate disruption was just the cost of strengthening the U.S. position down the road.
But the businesses feeling the pain disagreed.
Strongly. The business community, particularly groups like builders associations, real estate leaders, they pushed back hard. Their argument was that these tariffs weren't really protecting workers in the long run. They were mainly hurting American consumers through higher prices and less construction activity. And now you see whole communities, ones that depend heavily on construction and housing, really feeling that economic strain. It's a real debate about who bears the cost.
And with all this impact, especially on housing affordability, which is such a big issue, what about the current administration? Is there pressure to change course?
There is. But it's complicated. The Biden administration, to date, hasn't actually lifted these specific tariffs. Sources suggest there's a fear of political backlash, maybe from constituencies that still strongly support that protectionist approach.
So politics is definitely still in play.
Absolutely. But the economic reality is biting. Home sales have slowed. Construction is down in many areas. And that's leading politicians, actually from both parties, to increasingly call for, well, at least a review, a reassessment of these policies, especially when it involves a neighbor and traditionally a very reliable trading partner like Canada. The pressure is certainly mounting.
So we've traced how this policy initially set up to protect the domestic industry, kind of spiraled outwards. It led to some really significant, maybe unforeseen consequences. You have major companies facing losses, and perhaps most importantly, families finding it harder and harder to afford a place to live.
Yeah, it really leaves you with a big question, doesn't it? Can this damage actually be undone? Can the U.S. housing market find its equilibrium again, or have these tariffs caused a more permanent kind of instability? What seems clear from the sources is that in this particular trade dispute, it's the average person, the average American, who's ended up paying a significant price. And the warning is stark. Unless something changes, this housing crisis could get worse, potentially leaving key American industries struggling with what those sources call, pretty bluntly, self-inflicted wounds.
Yes, thanks for watching. Stay updated with Global Scope 360. Thank you so much. Subscribe to my channel and click the bell icon.